Anatomically modern Homo sapiens first appear about 100,000 years ago, and they first appear in Africa. Anthropologists generally classify these people as anatomically modern Homo sapiens, AMHS. The anatomically modern qualifier emphasizes that their bodies were very similar to those of modern humans, but they had not yet developed the cultural traditions, the symbolic behavior, or the technologies seen among later peoples. In other words, anatomically, they're exactly like you and I, but culturally, they were very, very different. The first widely accepted discovery of clearly very ancient but anatomically modern human remains occurred in 1868 at a site known as Cro-Magnon in France. It was a rock shelter. Railway workers basically exposed deposits that had human bones in them, and the bones were in sediments that contained mammoths and reindeer, as well as Aurignacian stone tools. We also see the remains from Wajak in Java, Indonesia. And this is an example of anatomically modern Homo sapiens and their distribution of where we find their bones. One of the things that we have noted is that osteological diagnosis of anatomically modern Homo sapiens is much broader than it is for earlier groups, because it encompasses a lot more variation than is known for earlier non-modern groups of humans. The following is a reasonable working description of modern humans as they are distinguished osteologically from other hominids. So these derived features include the fact that all anatomically moderns have this protruding chin. I know it's hard to imagine that this Jay Leno-esque feature, a protruding chin, is kind of like the hallmark, anatomical hallmark of anatomically modern humans. Okay. We have generally a very round skull with a high forehead. You've seen the other hominids, they don't have this real high forehead. And we have relatively reduced brow ridges. They're indistinguishable almost from the rest of the skull. We see much less robust postcranial skeleton. Our bones are relatively thin. We have long hands and short, thick pubic bones. Sorry, I went backwards. So these are just some of a graphical illustration showing you the cranial features of modern man versus Neanderthals. You see differences in the brain case shape, in the forehead, the brow ridges, the projection of the nasal bone differs, the cheek angulation differs, the chin differs. Yeah, this one swoops back, chinless. The occipital contour, they have that big bun there. So very anatomically modern Homo sapiens are quite distinct from the Neanderthals. Anatomically, what can we say about these anatomically moderns? Well, cranially, the cranial vault is enlarged and elevated in both the frontal and the parietal regions. The cranial bones have reduced thickness. The biparietal breadth is greater than the biauricular breadth, and they have a relatively rounded occipital. We also see reduced angulation of the occipital, a reduction of locations for the neck musculature, reduction in loss of the sagittal keel and parasagittal flattening, reduction of supraorbital tori into glabella with crust-like supraorbital margins, reduced prognathism, and reduced mandibular robusticity. So that's just the cranium. We also see, most importantly, development of bony chin. Don't forget that feature. And the brain and vocal tract seem to be adapted for human speech. Postcranially, they're quite distinct also. The limb bones are relatively robust. We see pronounced muscle markings on most of the bones. The axillary region of the scapula is usually unisulcate. We only see a sulcus on the ventral side. The distal phalanx of the thumb, two-thirds length of the proximal phalanx. We have very small apical tufts. The cortical bones are thinner than in previous hominids. We have long limbs, long legs relative to our trunk. We have a short, thick pubis bone, and our distal limb segments are long compared to the rest of the limb. The early anatomically modern Homo sapiens in general, these anatomically modern Homo sapiens undergo a massive shift in their behavior about 40,000 years ago. It was 40,000 years ago there was an abrupt change in the tool use behavior, the subsistence, the foraging behavior, and the symbolic expression throughout anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Africa, in Asia, and Europe, and Australia. So simultaneously we see massive behavioral changes in anatomically modern Homo sapiens across multiple continents. Humans began assembling a much more elaborate toolkit. They began to make tools from a wider variety of materials, including things like antler, ivory, bone. They began to transport raw materials over long distances. They began to construct elaborate shelters to reside in. This all happened 40,000 years ago. All of a sudden, 40,000 years ago, we see a massive influx of art, of ornamentation. We see ritual burials and other forms of symbolic expression. You know those little deity figurines? They only appear 40,000 years ago and more recently. They are not something that we see throughout human evolution. This change in the behavior of humans at 40,000 years ago is generally referred to as the human revolution. And this is a term that was coined by paleoanthropologist Paul Mellers because he believed that the behavioral shift that occurred 40,000 years ago is equivalent in terms of its influence to that of the Industrial Revolution. Because anatomically modern Homo sapiens were around 100,000 years ago through to the present, but they had a major change in behavior, anthropologists often like to distinguish between the early ones from 100 to say up to 40,000 years ago and the later ones from 40,000 years ago to the present. The early ones primarily were using Mousterian tools, much like the Neanderthals, but the later Upper Paleolithic peoples from 40,000 years ago to the present were using much more modern type of tools. We refer to them as Upper Paleolithic tools. So most of the following discussion that I'm going to be talking about pertains to Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern Homo sapiens, unless I say otherwise. So these are basic changes that we see 40,000 years ago. We see that the quality of life changed for anatomically modern Homo sapiens 40,000 years ago. Life expectancy reached that of historic hunter-gatherers by the Upper Paleolithic. They still had very high child mortality. Females, however, lived to around 40. Males were living to about 60. And this, I want to point out, exceeds Neanderthal life expectancy by 20%. So a big increase in life expectancy. Causes of death and injury during the late Paleolithic, we have little evidence of serious accidents and disease. The causes of death which left osteological evidence include things like severe fungal infection and dental abscesses, as well as hydrocephaly. We also see a few other debilitating but fatal conditions in anatomically modern Homo sapiens, like genetic dwarfism, arthritis, and bone deformation of your temporomandibular joint. Culturally, anatomically modern Homo sapiens were very distinct from the early anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The early anatomically modern Homo sapiens, as I mentioned, are generally associated with a Mousterian toolkit, much like what the Neanderthals were using from that time period. The Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern Homo sapiens, they shifted towards what we call blade tools. So they shifted from the manufacture of round flakes to the manufacture of blades. Blades are stone flakes that look like a modern knife blade. They are long, they are thin, they are flat, and they usually have a very sharp edge. They have a much longer cutting edge than flakes do, so it's much more efficient than older technologies. Flakes, they're more than twice as long as they are wide. The Upper Paleolithic peoples also were using many different materials compared to the early anatomically modern Homo sapiens. They used bone, and bone points greatly increased hunting efficiency. They used antlers, they used teeth. These people, over the 23,000 years of the Upper Paleolithic, they created dozens of distinctive toolkits. These are just 4 of some of the more commonly discussed toolkits that are found from this time period. We see the Aurignacian, which began 35,000 years ago in Europe. There constitutes large blades, burns, bone points. The Gravettian from 27,000 years ago, small parallel-sided blades, bone awls. The Solutrean from 21,000 years ago, leaf-shaped points. The Magdalenian from 16,000 to 500 years ago, carved, decorated bone and antler points. So we're seeing massive technological change in the tools that people from the Upper Paleolithic were using. These are just some examples of some of the tools from this time period. In addition, people from this time period were also hunting and gathering wild resources, and they probably used bows and arrows. We have evidence that bows and arrows were probably in use by 20,000 years ago. However, the oldest conclusive evidence comes from the late Magdalenian site about 12,000 years ago in both France and Germany. So the earliest evidence, archaeological evidence, is 12,000 years ago for bows and arrows, but we do believe that they were in use earlier. We also see spear throwing. We see bone spear throwers in use by 14,000 years ago, probably in use before that in the form of wooden spears. We see fish hooks in Europe also around 14,000 years ago. Although the emphasis here has been on some of the differences between these late and early Upper Paleolithic peoples, economically they were broadly similar. All Paleolithic peoples lived entirely by hunting and gathering wild resources. It is only in the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene between 11 to 9,000 years ago that we see evidence for a significant change when people began to domesticate wild plants and animals. Ethnographic observations on historic hunter-gatherers shows that the gathered vegetable component of the diet commonly outweighs the hunted component. That is, they are relying much more on plant foods than they are animal foods, at least among these historic hunter-gatherers. We also note that when hunting, the large herbivores were a vital source of food and provide a very critical raw material for these hunter-gatherers, because in addition to providing meat, they provided the hide, the sinew, the bone, the antlers, the ivory, and all of these were used to fashion a wide variety of implements and art objects. Although it's probable that these later Paleolithic people exploited resources more efficiently or more effectively than earlier people, there's very little evidence to truly support that. The best evidence concerns the fact that per unit time, Upper Paleolithic sites are much more numerous than the Mousterian ones, and this implies that Upper Paleolithic populations were larger and denser. The alternative is that these Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern Homo sapiens may have moved their camp more frequently. However, this is unlikely because these Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern Homo sapien sites are much more richer, meaning they have a lot more resources that were left behind, and they're much more extensive than the Mousterian sites. Since these Upper Paleolithic and Mousterian people lived under the same ecological conditions, these Upper Paleolithic peoples could only be more numerous if in fact they had a way of utilizing local resources more efficiently, and this theoretically this should be reflected in the food refuse of the two populations. The most obvious difference is that bird and fish bones are much more common in Upper Paleolithic sites than they are in the Mousterian sites, and this suggests that active fishing and fowling were unique to the Upper Paleolithic. So in terms of their subsistence strategy, they were more reliant on fish and fowl than were the Mousterian anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Okay. Although these early hominids had adapted to glacial conditions in Europe, these late Paleolithic people were the first to inhabit really, really harsh environments of easternmost Europe and northern Asia, places like Siberia. These are places where the winter is exceptionally long and exceptionally cold. The major adaptations that people have for dealing with cold not only include fire, but also clothing and housing. We note that the winter clothing incorporated fur, as evidenced by Mizin, Avido, and Kostenki, which is, these all show systematic evidence of fur trapping. We see the remains of wolves and Arctic fossils, very abundant at these sites, and the whole skeleton is there except for the paws, which gives us an indication of how these animals were actually hunted. These late Paleolithic people also colonized Americas and Australia, but we do not have any Mousterian or early anatomically modern Homo sapiens at these sites. So it's clear that they started in these northern eastern climates. We note that they created these dwellings in the late Paleolithic. They occupied rock shelters and cave mouths. They built walls and modified natural shelters to make them more habitable. They constructed dwellings for the first time. They were using large bones, wooden poles, hides in construction. Classic example is a Gravician site in Poland and Czechoslovakia and UK and in Russia. We see massive, massive structures that they were creating for to reside in. This is an example. Look at all these big, monster bones, and they created effectively a house out of it. And then you can imagine, putting hides or something on top of it to keep it warm on the inside. As I was mentioning, clothing at Mizin and Kostenki, this is in Russia, we see systematic fur trapping. Also in Sungir, at 22,000 years ago, we see tailored clothing. It has discolored soil, strings of IV beads paralleling the skeletons of 3 individuals. I think there were over 20,000 beads on these individuals. They have shirts, jackets, trousers, moccasin, all at 22,000 years ago. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens also had the ability to control fire, and that was one of the main ways that they were able to adapt to living in a very, very cold environment. In Central Europe, they burned fresh bone for fuel because trees were very scarce. The Upper Paleolithic dwellings usually had ash and charcoal inside them. In Clay's river mouth site in Africa, this is Middle and Upper Paleolithic, and we see stacked hearths. So over multiple years, multiple occupations, they were constructing hearths at this site. These are the Sungir burials. You can see all the beads, surrounding all the skeletons. That they were laid side by, or head to head, rather. Art and ornamentation of the Upper Paleolithic. Cave paintings first appear 40,000 years ago. There are more than 150 caves that we know of that have cave paintings. There's iron, magnesium, calcium, and mineral extenders, plant oils, binders. There are animals at the Magdalene sites 16 to 11,000 years ago. There are human cave paintings at the Gravician sites from 28 to 20,000 years ago. So we have quite a bit of evidence regarding these paintings. We also see some sculpture, feminine figurines, deity figurines. We see decorated tools, we see jewelry, beads, necklaces. We see all kinds of art and ornamentation. But note, throughout all of human evolution, we don't have this. Not until 40,000 years ago. Here are some of these, Venus figurines, tons of them. We see the Sungir site, some decorative items, including all these little holes, a decorated scapula bone. Here are some other cave paintings. The burials of the Lower Paleolithic were very simple, much like Neanderthal graves. However, they consistently became more complex throughout the Upper Paleolithic. grave goods such as the sungu beards and spears. They often contain isolated scraps of human bone. There is evidence that it could have been a carnivore exhumation, but some people have even suggested that it was deliberate disassociation of these bones. At Abri-Pataude in France 22,000 years ago, a female skull was positioned among 3 stones 4 meters from a cluster of postcrania, possibly hers and her child's. In Singir, Russia, we see a polished human femur, and other French sites we see shaped and perforated human bones. So all these are suggestive that people were using these bones in specific symbolic manner.